So, picking up where we left off in Act 4, Scene 3, on page 117 of your text, Malcolm and Macduff are speaking, and Malcolm uses this extended metaphor of Scotland as a wounded woman to describe the state the country's in. So, saying it weeps, it bleeds, each day a new gash is adding to her wounds, and her there is referring to Scotland. So he thinks that he's got lots of hands, and you can see in the note that means soldiers who are ready to come from England to fight on his behalf. And notice that he says that he's going to tread upon the tyrant's head, and that's following up in the motif across the play of the idea of heads, hair, and crowns. And in fact, he does, Macduff does cut off Macbeth's head at the very end of the play. So going on from this, Macduff questions what a king should be like, and Malcolm's answer is a bit of a strange one, because he says that he's full of vices. In other words, he's worse than Macbeth. He even uses this metaphor, says, esteem him as a lamb. In other words, Macbeth is Christ-like, like the Lamb of God, by comparison to Malcolm. So Malcolm saying that he himself is evil. And Macduff says that no, this can't be possible. Macbeth is the absolute worst. Not in the legions of horrid hell can come a devil more damned in evils to top Macbeth. But Macduff is absolutely adamant that he is terrible. And you can see there that there's this list of his own vices. He says that he is luxurious, avaricious, false, deceitful, and so on. This long list of adjectives. And he goes on to say specifically what's wrong with himself, that he has the sin of lust, that he's into womanizing. He says, your wives, your daughters, in other words, not just Macduff's wife, but all of the Lord's wives, all of the Lord's daughters, could not fill up the cistern of my lust. In other words, I've got so much lust in me for women. There's a bit of a dramatic irony there that he's mentioning wives and daughters to Macduff, because as we've seen in the previous scene, Act 4, Scene 3, his wife and children were murdered. Again, Macduff actually says, well, hang on, this is not a problem. Boundless intemperance in nature is a tyranny. So he's saying that it is a tyranny to be lustful. It hath been the untimely emptying of the happy throne and fall of many kings. So many kings have fallen down and lost their thrones because of their lust for women. But then he goes on to say, hang on, it's not that much of a problem. We have willing dames enough. He's saying lots of women are going to throw themselves at you when you're king. And you won't, there'll be so many women, you won't even have time to take them all on board, so to speak. And it's not that much of a problem. Malcolm goes on then, though, to say, well, actually, this isn't the only vice that I have. This isn't the only sin I have. I also have the sin of avarice. In other words, the sin of greed. And he's saying that he's so greedy. He says, my more having would be as such a source to make me hunger more, that I should forge quarrels unjust against the good and loyal, destroying them for their wealth. So in other words, he says he would manufacture arguments as an excuse to steal his lord's thing. And Macduff says this avarice sticks deeper than summer seeming lust. So he says, actually, hang on, this greed, this avarice is worse than your lust, but it's not too much of a problem. Yet do not fear, he says. Scotland hath foisons to fill up your will. What that means is Scotland is rich enough that it doesn't matter if you're a bit greedy and you want to take people's stuff. And in any case, he says, all these are portable with other graces weighted. So he says, well, other qualities will balance this out. As long as you're a good king on balance, it doesn't matter if you're lustful, if you want sex with lots of women. It doesn't matter if you're greedy, if you take the Lord's lands, for example, and castles. But then Malcolm says, but I have none. In other words, I have no other good qualities. And then again, he had before a list of adjectives about all of his vices. Now he gives a list of abstract nouns, saying, I'm the absolute worst. Justice, verity, temperance, stableness, bounty, perseverance, mercy, lowliness, devotion, patience, courage, fortitude. All of these are abstract nouns naming qualities that a good king should have. I have no relish of them, but he has many crimes. And then he goes on to use a metaphor. I should pour the sweet milk of concord into hell. This metaphor echoing Lady Macbeth's metaphor in Act 1 when she says about Macbeth, thou art too full of the milk of human kindness. In other words, saying, I will be a terrible king, I would cause uproar. And at this, Macduff finally stops making excuses for him. He finally loses it and says, oh, Scotland, Scotland. This technique, by the way, is known as an apostrophe. Not an apostrophe like the little punctuation sign you use for a missing letter. Apostrophe is when you're speaking to a thing or speaking to someone who isn't there. And so he's almost crying out for Scotland, weeping for Scotland, that their only hope of a decent king, the rightful king, is Malcolm, but Malcolm, as he's just pointed out, is a terrible king, or would be a terrible king. He's a terrible person. Malcolm says, if such a one be fit to govern, speak, I am as I have spoken. So he says, tell me if I am fit to govern. And Macduff says, fit to govern, no, not to live. And then again, he uses this apostrophe. He says, oh, nation miserable. So he's still talking to Scotland. With an untitled tyrant, and this untitled tyrant is Macbeth. Bloody sceptred, when shalt thou see thy wholesome days again? So he's still talking to Scotland here, but there's also a bit of a possibility that he's talking to Malcolm. He's identifying one with the other, but particularly he's talking to Scotland. Since that the truest issue of thy throne by his own interdiction stands accursed and does blaspheme his breed. So the truest issue of thy throne, as you can see in the notes, the legitimate heir, in other words, Malcolm, is condemning himself. Then he definitely is talking to Malcolm here. He's saying your father was sainted, your queen spent all her time praying, often on her knees. And then he's saying that, well, look, evil's everywhere. I've been banished from Scotland by those evils that thou repeatest upon thyself. So you're saying that you're evil, but I left Scotland because of evil. And then again, oh, my breast. So another apostrophe there. Oh, my breast. He's talking to his own breast. And then he says, thy hope ends here. So in other words, he's talking to himself and saying, you don't have any more hope. And he's being really, really overly dramatic. Well, possibly not overly dramatic, but he's being very, very passionate here. And Malcolm picks up on his passion. Malcolm says, this noble passion. So yes, you're angry, but child of integrity. So your passion is the child of integrity, bit of a metaphor there. So in other words, you're angry because you're honest, moral and truthful, which is what integrity means. But then he goes on to actually let on that he was just testing Malcolm. He says, for even now I put myself to thy direction and unspeak mine own detraction. In other words, I'm going to deny what I've just said to you. Here abjure the taints and blames I laid upon myself. So abjure, as you can see in the notes, means reject. So in other words, he's saying, actually, I'm not a terrible person. I was lying. He says, I'm yet unknown to women. So far from being lusty and wanting to have sex with lots of women, he's actually a virgin. Never was forsworn. So Malcolm's saying he never lied in his life. And then he carries on, my first false speaking was this upon myself. In other words, the first lie he told ever in his life was to you, Macduff. And he said all of these things in order to try to draw out Macduff, to find out what Macduff's reaction would be, to see if Macduff would support him as an evil tyrant or if Macduff would only support him as a good king. Macduff has passed the test because of the way he reacted. Oh, my breast, thy hope ends here. And so Malcolm is happy to trust Macduff. And so at this point, Malcolm says, now we'll together. In other words, we'll go, and the chance of goodness be like our warranted quarrel. So he's saying, well, look, we're going to join old Seward with his 10,000 warlike men and we'll go fight Macbeth together. But then he has to ask the question, why are you silent? Macduff's often silent. We'll see that a little bit later on. And Macduff says, such welcome and unwelcome things at once. 'Tis hard to reconcile. Note that Macduff, we found out in the previous scene, the scene involving Lennox, that Macduff has already been cagey. He's already refused to enlist to fight against Macbeth, and he's cagey about enlisting now. In this section, we hear about King Edward the Confessor, so the King of England at the time, the king who's hosting Malcolm in his court. And we find out about a most miraculous work in his good king, that the king has been healing people through performing miracles. Remember that King Edward the Confessor is the only king of England who's been sainted. And we can see that there's a bit of a contrast here. We've already had the metaphor of Scotland as a sick or wounded woman. And so England is being healed by its king, unlike sick Scotland, which is living under the tyrant Macbeth. So Ross then arrives, and Ross has a message to bring to Macduff. As we know, the audience, it's the message about the death of his wife and children. But note that that Ross doesn't go straight into this. He starts, alas, poor country, almost afraid to know itself, it cannot be called our mother but our grave. In other words, he's using metaphors for Scotland. He says that Scotland isn't our mother, your country. There's a general idea that your country should be like your mother, looking after you, but it's like a grave, a deathly place. He then goes on to describe the situation in Scotland using these lovely onomatopoeic words, sighs, groans, shrieks that rend the air. So there's a really hellish atmosphere in Scotland. Notice, though, that he's talking about the general atmosphere in Scotland, not coming straight out with it and telling Macduff what's happened to his wife and children. So then we move down here, and Macduff actually openly says, how does my wife? And Ross says, why, well, and all my children well too. The tyrant has not battered at their peace, asked Macduff. No, they were at peace when I did leave them. And that's true, they were at peace when I did leave them. You could almost even say that they're well, because as far as Ross is concerned, they're well in heaven now that they're dead. And so what he's doing is our classic technique of equivocation. He's telling the truth, but also concealing the real truth at the same time. Notice there that he's still delaying. He's still not coming out with the truth down here. And instead of really telling Macduff what's happened to his wife and children, he turns to Malcolm and says, your eye in Scotland, as you can see from the notes, that means your presence in Scotland would create soldiers. In other words, if you came back to Scotland, Malcolm, people would join up to fight. And then he's even said, make our women fight. And we've got a bit of a contrast here with Lady Macbeth. Lady Macbeth, she's been a bit of a fighter. She's taken on the mantle of being more masculine and more manly, but she's doing it for evil. What Malcolm would do is make our women fight, and they'd be doing it for good. Notice, even now, Ross is still delaying this bad news for Macduff. Well, I could answer this comfort with the light, but I have words that will be howled out in the desert air. But he doesn't say what these words are. And then Macduff asks, well, is this problem something that would upset people in general? Or is it some fee grief due to some single breast? Is it for a single person, this bad news? And Ross says, bad for everyone, particularly bad for you. Macduff's line, if it be mine, keep it not from me, quickly let me have it, it's deeply ironic as far as the audience is concerned, because this news has already been delayed by Ross for so long. And notice even now, Ross uses a bit of a tactic of disassociation. He uses the metonym. A metonym, by the way, metonym, is when the part of something is used to refer to the whole. You could just call it a metaphor if you like, but technically it's a metonym. And he says, let not your ears despise my tongue forever. So please, Macduff, with your ears, don't despise me with my tongue forever. And referring to Macduff by his ears and himself by his tongue, it kind of means that it's just body parts dealing with each other with this message rather than two people. And he can kind of disassociate himself from the blame of passing on this bad news. Macduff, I guess at it. And then finally, Ross actually comes out with it. Your castle surprise, your wife and babe savagely sorted. Note the sibilance here of the repeated S sounds, giving it a really, really sinister tone when he finally says what happened. And then he gives a bit of an excuse to relate the man of war and the quarry of these murdered deer to add to the death of you. So the quarry of these murdered deer means that there's a big slump of slaughtered animals, this metaphor that he uses to refer to the wife and children, and saying, hang on, telling you risks killing you as well. So distancing himself a bit from what he said. Notice that Macduff doesn't even respond at this point, that it's Malcolm who picks up and says, merciful heaven. And we can imagine it can be staged in different ways, but Macduff is clearly completely dumbfounded by this news. He can't even respond. When he does respond, he gives brief answers, just, my children too, my wife killed too. And then, he has no children, all my pretty ones. So even when he does have a longer speech at the bottom of the page here, it's still short sentences, brief rhetorical questions, brief exclamatives. Macduff is clearly bowled over by this news. But then note how Malcolm reacts. Malcolm says, be comforted. Let us make medicines of our great revenge to cure this deadly grief. So Malcolm is straight into, rather than trying to console Macduff, trying to use Macduff's reaction to enlist him in fighting against Macbeth. And notice here, just after Macduff finally does have a bit of a longer speech about what's happened, Malcolm's reaction, dispute it like a man, be a man, and almost echoing Lady Macbeth's words in Act 4, Scene 1. And Macduff is finally ready to talk. He's really quite self-critical when he does talk. He's talking to himself, calling himself sinful Macduff. They were all struck for thee, and thee obviously here means you. And he points out they're all punished for my fault, not for their own demerits, but for mine fell slaughter. And this word slaughter is almost a biblical reference, referring to the slaughter of the innocents by King Herod in the Bible. And then Malcolm again, spurring him on, let grief convert to anger, encouraging him to enlist and fight against Macbeth. And when Macduff finally agrees, Malcolm says, this tune goes manly, praising him for his manly decision.